Shalom everyone, you're here again with another episode of Tetsave Mikra. This week we are continuing into the temple, and this actually is going to be expanding into temple service and understanding temple service from the biblical perspective. I know as a fact that there are other teachers out there, some of them actually friends of mine, who have done a lot of work in this field, but I feel that the Bible has been pushed aside in favor of the Mishnah, and there's a lot I can say about that. I happened to just finish a course about the Second Temple period, and the temple came up again as a very central subject. And we also spoke about the dynamics between the different sects in Judaism. So I feel as if there's a lot that can be said extra about this subject from the biblical perspective, and I really want to develop this a little bit more. And that will be part of the topic of when we go into the other parashiyot that deal with the temple, especially the first couple chapters of Leviticus, because I'm not going to go into the procedure of exactly how to slaughter an animal and how to dismember it and so on, because I think most people understand the principle. But what I'll probably do in Leviticus is expand on the subject of the temple a little bit more from the biblical perspective, what we actually know was done in the first temple period and the beginning of the Second Temple prior to the sectarian split in the Jewish world and the external influences of different cultures, and also the subject of the Levites, the role of Levites in the temple, and the subjects of things that maybe some things of contrast between the first temple and the Second Temple. Levitical roles and things like that, priestly roles, priestly families, and issues like that. As you know, my degree is in history and biblical studies, which is a wonderful combination. You get the tools of how to read the Bible correctly, and you also get the historical setting, which is a perfect match. In any case, the thing that this parasha has a very personal touch for me. Because one of probably the first academic article or quasi-academic article that I read about anything in biblical studies was when I was around 15 years old. I walked into a local library near my school. I actually went to school I actually traveled every day for about 45 minutes to an hour to my school. I didn't study locally, and 45 minutes to an hour is actually, here in Israel, is a very long time to go to school. Most people, if they learn far away from home, they usually stay in a dormitory. But in my case, I had to travel every day. And by the way, I noticed sometimes in the recordings I mess up words. For example, last week I wanted to say one word, another word came out. It's kind of end up being kind of funny. So please remember that Hebrew is actually my first language. The fact that I speak very good English is not proof that I understand the English language in its fullness. But in any case, so if you ever hear something funny, just realize where it comes from. But in any case, and I remember walking to the library and looking at this book. I mean, there were actually a lot of scientific books there as well. And the first thing I did was I was flipping through a magazine. There was a magazine with an article there about the choshen, the breastplate. Probably the name plate is a little bit misleading. I mean, everyone, for example, ever seen Indiana Jones, mentioning Indiana Jones from last week as well, the melting Nazi faces, which made a couple of people laugh. A lot of the movies, what they do is they present it as an actual plate, a gold plate, and that's a misconception, and I'm going to explain what it actually is. But I remember it was an article about the choshen and a discussion about the choshen itself. Possible historical reconstructions of the choshen, what are the urim and tumim, or the urim and thumim as they call them in English, and a whole bunch of stuff. It was several pages long. I remember actually asking to photocopy or Xerox the articles, and I still have it, I think, somewhere in this house. Since that article, I mean, I've read a lot of other things. There were encyclopedias. I mean, I started basically flipping through these books, and this is why I say, I've been studying biblical studies from a very young age. I mean, not only what we did as classic biblical studies is in school, traditional Tanakh that we did in school, which actually at the time took the highest level of exams, state exams that actually exist, and I think it's gone up a little bit more since then, but I took some of the highest level exams that we had back then. And as I mentioned, Bible studies are actually mandatory in schools here in Israel, unless you belong to the Arab sector, and then you don't have to learn Tanakh. But the Jewish sector, even if you're in a secular school, there has to be at least like 2 hours of Tanakh a week or something like that. With us, it was a lot more than that. And the thing that was very interesting is this discussion, or these attempt to reconstruct. But I remember also looking at how they were trying to present the priestly garments. And this is one of the things that, one of the main focuses we're going to talk about today. I'm trying to split up, because we have a leap year in the rabbinic calendar. So we have Truma, and then Tetsave, and then Vayakel, and Pekudei. So it's going to be a little difficult to kind of spread all of this out, because they basically repeat one another. So I might cover all the priestly garments today, and then maybe for Pekudei we'll have to do something a little different. We'll see. In any case, first of all, these garments are referred to as lechavod v'letifaret. This is verse 28, verse 2. Sorry, chapter 28, verse 2. Lechavod v'letifaret, kavod, honor, tiferet is glory. The principle of the priestly garments is that the priest is basically the high priest, for example, and the priestly order are basically one of the commanding bodies of the Jewish people. You know, when you have a leader, if he shows up in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt to an official meeting, if he has an international meeting or something, everyone's going to make fun of them. I mean, to this very day, to the principle of clothing that we live by is that people of high status in our society have to be dressed in a certain way. I'm not talking about rich people. They can do whatever they want. You know, I once met a very, very wealthy man, basically a multi-millionaire, who happened to be the grandfather of my chavruta, my study partner, when I was in yeshiva. He was a multi-millionaire. And he never dressed like really fancy. I mean, I never saw him wearing something like super duper expensive. He never wore jewelry. He never wore something that was very, very unique. The difference was that he would wear a shirt so you could see it's a higher quality. And I remember asking him about this, and he said to me, listen, you know, I need to cover my body. I don't need to cover my body with gold. That's for people who have a point to be made. And that's the thing. The priestly garments are made of some of the most expensive fabrics and materials known to mankind to this very day. I mean, the material used to dye the clothing could have been actually very expensive. I mean, there's the whole debate here, as I mentioned last time, regarding wool and tchelet. Was it in the argaman? Were these actually made from the mollusk, and therefore every couple grams of it is very, very expensive? It's possible, again, as I mentioned, there are some technical issues here with the subject of shatnez. Were the priests really allowed to wear shatnez in the temple? What we actually know about Egyptian fabrics, but also have to remember that the Egyptians also received taxes and tributes from other nations, which means it's quite possible they did have wool dyed with a royal blue. But the Egyptians, on the other hand, were not very big on wearing wool. They actually mostly wore linen. So there are a lot of questions here that need to be asked that we don't necessarily have answers for. But the point is that the priestly garments are for the glory of these leaders. There are even some rabbis who wanted to bring up the idea that Levites, when they were in service, had unique clothing as well. Though we don't hear anything about that in the Tanakh. There are some places where it could be a hint. Like, for example, it mentions that David's sons were Kohanim. Now, quite people ask the question, what do you mean that David's sons were Kohanim? How can they be Kohanim? They're not from the line of Aaron. So the concept there is that what it really means that they were temple servants. They had some kind of function in the temple, but they were not allowed to approach the altar. They were not allowed to go into the temple itself. So we need to understand the concept of a Kohen. A Kohen is a person of service. That's the first meaning of the term Kohen. And the secondary meaning is Cohen in the sense of what we know as a descendant of Aaron, a descendant of Aharon. And we need to differentiate these 2 points from one another because it creates a lot of confusion, including the development of the thing known as the order of Melchizedek, as if there's some kind of other priestly line. And it's a misconception of the function of being a servant of God versus being an actual Kohen of the temple. I mean, for example, a person could become a Kohen at the period when they actually were allowed to build altars in what we call their backyards. A person could function as a Kohen. The Talmud says he is a Kohen and his sons are Leviim, or Hu Kohen Ubanav Kohanim. He is a Kohen and his sons function as Kohanim. When people did their own service, when they had their local altar and they didn't really have priestly families, because the development of priestly families and wasn't that widespread before the times, actually maybe even the times of the Second Temple. It's a whole discussion by itself. That's part of what we're going to expand in the future. But the point is that a Kohen is a person of service. So you have a Kohen that's by heritage and a Kohen by function. And the same thing with the term Levi. Samuel or Shmuel is presented in certain places and it says that Shmuel's sons were Leviim. But Shmuel's sons were not Leviim because they were Ephraimites. They came from Ephraim. And what's possible there is, again, that the Book of Chronicles has a memory that the sons of Shmuel had some kind of function in the temple, but it knew they weren't Kohanim, because it's also impossible. They knew that they weren't Kohanim. They didn't come from a priestly family. So it said, oh, they're Leviim. But the idea there basically is that they had some kind of function in the temple. They were the sons of the famous prophet, so they were given an honorary function in the temple. Maybe they did certain things. Then maybe they taught there. I mean, remember, Levites' function is to be teachers as well. Kohanim are part of the teaching system as well, but the Leviim were more scattered around the country, so the Levitical function was much higher in the teaching level, while Kohen was more a leader of service and things like that. And I'm basing some of these principles, by the way, on the works of Menachem Haran, Dr. Menachem Haran, the late Menachem Haran, who, I hope I've said his name enough times so people remember, who actually wrote several books about the subject of temple, of institutions in ancient Israel, First Temple Israel, pre-First Temple Israel. Very, very interesting stuff. Some of his conclusions, as always, you can disagree with conclusions. People tell me as well, we disagree with you, and I'm like, I'm perfectly fine with that because we're just human. We need to realize that this is how we develop knowledge until we find the answer. And he actually emphasizes, unlike a lot of other sources I've seen, he actually emphasizes what the Levites would do. And he really points out that the Levites had a more social function as teachers and knowers of Torah, which were amongst the entire land. Unlike the Kohanim, which clearly were mostly focused around the temple and would arrive at the temple every once in a while to work. And when they were not at the temple, they would just live probably not too far away. There's a lot of questions that we don't necessarily know. But the idea of clothing in the ancient world, and we can see it in images. If you ever go to the British Museum, for example, you can see some of the clothing there etched into the walls of the different palaces. The more elaborate and more layers you wore, the more important you were. And what's very interesting, for example, in the ancient world, kings also functioned as priests. In many cases, the king and the high priest were the same person. The king would function almost solely like the high priest of the Jewish world, of the Tanakh, the Israelites. And the kings usually wore very elaborate clothing, although there were other priests and temple heads and so on. The king would, in many cases, have the rights to be the high priest. The king would lead, for example, the very famous Akito service, which was the New Year service that they had where they cleansed the temple, which, by the way, is not really necessarily like Yom Kippurim. It was done on a different day of the year. There's a whole subject there as well. Though we don't know too much about the Akito, it's mentioned in a few places. We do have a way of reconstructing elements of the Akito, and there are only some things which resemble Yom Kippurim. In many cases, the king's children function as priests, even daughters, which is different than what we have in the Torah. In the Torah, it's very patriarchal, very male. Women were not part of the service itself. There's actually a reason for that. The temple, obviously, women menstruate. There's a problem of bleeding even in the middle. It's going to be part of the program we're going to do on Practical Torah, the laws of Nidah, together with my wife Naomi. And so there's always this danger of contaminating the temple sphere. While with men, there's less of that issue. And again, I know that for a lot of people, there's this major discussion of the sexist nature of certain things, and we're going to discuss that as well. But we need to remember that's a very modern term. And I'm not convinced that the Bible is sexist. I think that that there's a very specific direction the Bible goes to, and I don't think the ancient world was as sexist as people think. People want to describe it that way, but it's not necessarily the case. Women actually had a lot of place of honor, and it's actually after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the developments of the Second Temple and the destruction of the Second Temple, and the changes that happened in the world in general, especially under Catholicism, people started becoming very sexist. For example, women were highly accepted in singing in public, being in service in temples, not necessarily in the sexual way that we hear a lot about the Kadisha, but actually being priestesses and so on, and being oracles and asking women to their opinion, and women being in charge of children's education in a very important way. And I think it's the Catholic Church that really made sure women get pushed out of everything, and that influenced the entire world. We have to remember that cultures influenced one another. Now, the clothing itself, as I mentioned, the more layers you had, the more important you were. And this is why we see that Aharon, being the high priest, has a very large collection of clothing, 8 garments we call them. And the regular Kohanim, his sons, have, the Kohen Hediot, as they call them in the latter terminology of the Second Temple, because there's the Kohen Gadol, or HaKohen Gadol. In the Tanakh, he's actually referred to as Kohen HaRosh, the head priest, not the high priest, but actually the head priest. And the Kohen HaRosh is mentioned several times in the Tanakh. And basically the garments themselves are known as the Choshen. If we're talking about the high priest garments, we have the Choshen, which is the breastplate, the Ephod, which is basically almost like an armor. There are in a lot of classic paintings that we see, or especially if they're based on Rashi, it's more like an apron. Maimonides and actually Josephus describe it more as the armor of a soldier, so it's actually more over the back and a little bit in the front. We have the me'il, which is me'il basically translated as a coat, but really what it is, it's an upper external garment. It's like that is more like an apron than anything else, but the thing is that it's actually front and back. How long it was, we'll see. There's the kutonet, which basically is an I wouldn't call it an undergarment, but it was a like a tunic. The idea itself, it's a very long tunic. Again, a lot of people go, for example, kutonet has to do with, first of all, the word me'il might be from the root me'al, the upper garment, versus the kutonet, which a lot of people try to say, oh, maybe made from cotton. It wasn't. But the kutonet is actually well-documented garment. It's mentioned in a few other languages as well, which is basically a simple tunic a person would wear. But the difference was the kutonet, unlike, for example, the chatzait, which is the skirt which most men would wear. Men didn't wear upper clothing. Most men during the summertime, especially in this region where it doesn't always necessarily get cold, most men would wear just a skirt with no shirt. Shirts were something which people would wear mostly during the winter, and the kutonet is basically a combination of both. So it's a larger, longer garment that was probably used mostly by people of status. It wasn't something that you could just pull off a shelf and wear. And it's referred to as a kutonet tashbetz, and tashbetz, there are a lot of opinions what the tashbetz actually is. Some people refer to it as little squares. Some people say that it was woven in a certain way. Excuse me. A lot of different theories about this. A mitznefet from the word tzanaf, which is to wrap, which is basically a type of head wrap. An avnet, which is a belt. They wore a belt. And the one thing not mentioned here in verse 4 is the tzitz, which is the golden plate on the forehead. And they're referred to as bigdei kodesh, holy garments, and they're done for him for his lechahen, to actually be in service. It means the high priest didn't really wear the clothing all the time. They actually wore the clothing only inside the temple itself. When they were walking around the street, they just probably wore just regular clothing. They just wore whatever garments they had, probably of a higher quality than most of society, because they were some of the most high-ranking individuals in the Israelite world. So the high priest would usually wear something a little bit more elaborate than a regular person, but they were not allowed to wear these garments outside of the temple, including the big question about the high priest. Did he actually ever leave the temple? I've been asked about this. Is a high priest allowed to leave the temple? And my personal answer is yes, that the limitation that we find in the book of Numbers is mostly about funerals. This is the way it's usually understood. But when a high priest, being who he is, sometimes has to leave to conduct an important meeting or conduct something important for the people of Israel, he was actually allowed to leave. So we start off with the ephod. So the ephod is made of zahav, tchelet, va'argaman. This is verse 6. Tola'at shani v'shesh moshzar ma'aseh choshev. So it's made out of gold, which basically make gold strings. As I mentioned last time, I remember seeing the first images of weaving the colors together with the gold thread with the Temple Institute. It was pretty amazing. So we have tchelet, argaman, the red or purple, depends who you ask. Tola'at shani, what's known as crimson, which is actually made from an unclean animal, and this one we know as a fact. So people always ask the question, how can tchelet, one of the reasons they reject the idea of wearing tchelet, the murex tchelet and the other colors, is they say, oh, these are unclean animals. But the tola'at shani is actually very explicit, because tola'at means a worm, and it's what we refer today in Hebrew as a knima. It's basically a little critter that attaches itself to oak trees, and it produces a color. And you're not using the actual body, you're using some substances that they excrete. And the same thing with the tchet and the argaman. So I understand the concern here, but then on the other hand, we do know that these substances exist. And the tola'at shani, the crimson, we know as a fact, comes from an unclean animal. So it's an interesting discussion. Shesh moshzar, basically shesh is another word for linen. Okay, we have the word shesh, then we also have, for example, the word pishtan later on. It's referred to as a ma'aseh choshev, and ma'aseh choshev basically is the work of thinking. It's not just weaving with no thought. It's actually an elaborate. The concept of chashav is to think, and but the ma'aseh choshev can also be connected to the concept that the garment has connective parts as well that connect to the breastplate, or in this case, this is the ephod, so it connects to the breastplate, and it has two shoulder pads. It has shtei ktefot, so katef is the shoulder, so these are shoulder sections, and it really doesn't tell you much about the structure. So really, to understand this, you need to look into garments in the ancient world. And what I found while looking at all these images is that the focus, if the person's wearing a lot more clothing, I noticed that the focus is really on the top. Now, for example, there's this term known as karbela. And karbela was a garment that used to exist in the ancient world, which comes from the word lekarbel, which is not a Hebrew word, by the way. But for example, the term appears in the karbel is to really wrap yourself from on top. And this karbela, which is mentioned in the Talmud as well, this karbela was mostly something you wore in the top part of your body. And karbal is probably related to the word mesurbal. So mesurbal in modern Hebrew usually means something which is awkward, something which is done in the wrong way. But it could be that mesurbal and mekurbal, though they sound the same because of the vowel point formation, but I think there might be mesurbal is the Hebrew parallel of the Aramaic or Akkadian term karbela, but the idea is it's something you wear on top. And when I looked at a lot of these images, because I actually sat down to read an entire book just about clothing in the Bible, what came out a lot was this: everything was on top. So I actually tend to agree with the Rambam interpretation versus the Rashi. It's not an apron; it doesn't go on your legs or behind. It actually is the opposite. Now, it's possible that Rashi was influenced by clothing that he saw in his own world. We have to remember that commentators would comment on things based on the world they live in and not pierce through into the history of things. And I think the fact that a lot of people of status in Europe, because remember Rashi lived in France, a lot of people of status in Europe wore apron-like things. Very commonly, they would wear like an apron And I think we still see some echoes of this. For example, if you look at European traditional ceremonial garments, you see that the top is very elaborate as well, but there's always this like little, in many cases, there's this little apron thing that shows up. So Rashi, because of the shoulders, he wanted to move it to the back. It's possible this is the reason he got to this. But it seems more, if we look at the ancient Near East, it seems more something that's on the top part of the body, covering the back, covering the front. The front is covered by the choshen, the back is covered by the ephod. And we also have Josephus who mentions this. The only thing is that Josephus exaggerates with the quantity of gold. We have to understand, you have to be very careful with Josephus and when he describes things, because you have to remember that he was a captive Jew living in a Roman culture that was very hostile to Jews after the rebellion. And he wanted to glorify the Jewish world by saying certain things. And when we compare his material, when we compare sections to one another, or we look very deeply into what he says, you realize that he was exaggerating in different places, especially when it comes to the temple. For example, he describes the altar being 72 cubits by 72 cubits, which is huge. I mean, it's impossible. He was trying to impress. That was really the point. He was trying to impress the Romans. So we have to be very careful with this. So he describes some of the priestly vestments as being almost completely made out of gold, or that the gold was so prominent in the clothing that it looked like armor. And in truth, probably what we're looking at is an exaggeration, but there was obviously gold, and the gold was present. You could see the gold. It was part of the entire fabric. But he probably used the word armor not just to say it looks like Roman armor, it's made out of metal. I think he wanted to also focus on the fact that it actually was structured a little bit like Roman armor as well. And then we have the 12 stones. And 12 stones are referred to as Charash Even Pituchei Chotam. Maaseh Charash Even Pituchei Chotam, verse 11. Now, Charash is is a word used, for example, like the word choresh, to edge into the ground. Now, in rabbinic literature, and this is one of the things I want to create a contrast here from rabbinic literature to what actually was done in the ancient world. When they would edge something into a stone, they literally carved out of the stone bits. This is what was done. In gems that we find, for example, Egyptian gems that we find, if they carved something into it, they literally carved into it. In rabbinic literature, they go on this line of the stones have to be complete, and therefore they didn't edge into the stone. They somehow cracked it, so the stone was complete. There's the whole legend of the Tola'at Shamir, the worm that can crack stone by just placing it. So they would write in some way or another on the stone, and the worm would just would scroll around the writing itself, because it may be something it was trying to eat or something like that, and it would cause it to crack. Again, these are all miraculous stories and miraculous ideas. But at the end of the day, let's be practical. So Maaseh Charash obviously means that they were edged into the stone. It's like Charisha. It's like carving into the stone itself. Pituchei Chotam is Pituach. A pituach is the elaborate construction of something. So Pituchei Chotam is like a stamp. Like a person would have a stamp that you carve into. For example, if you have a stamp that you use, for example, in bullas, what they would do is they would carve into the stone or into whatever, the bone, whatever they were using to create the stamp itself. And then when they stamp it, the clay that they would use, part of the clay would go into the edging and then create an image, a word or an image or whatever it might be. And that's the idea. You had a stone, the 12 stones, each one of them had writing on it, edged into the stone itself, but deep enough that if you would have pressed it onto clay, you would actually see the words. Now, some people say maybe this also meant that they actually wrote the letters in reverse, so when you press them, the word would come out properly. So when you looked at the choshen itself, you could not actually see the words would be reversed. I'm not convinced that this is actually true, and I think that this is an incorrect assumption. Now, the verses I'm looking at here are specifically talking about the stones on the shoulders, the Avnei Shoham, what's presumably are black stones. But this also applies to 12 stones on the breastplate itself. And the purpose is because he is a representative of Israel, he needs to literally burden on his shoulders the responsibility of Israel. So putting stones on his shoulders, I would say, is very symbolic of the idea of carrying the weight of Israel on his shoulders. I think it's not by chance. I think there's an actual clear metaphor there. What I find intriguing is why are the names repeated twice? Why is it also on the shoulders and the breastplate? And in truth, I don't have an answer. Wouldn't it be just enough to have one? No. It could be that maybe the shoulders represent all of Israel, while the chest is supposed to be representative of the individualized heart of each one of Israel, the thought itself. The burden of Israel is on his shoulders, but so you have all names edged on like two stones on his shoulders, but on his chest, where his heart is, where his thoughts are, because in the ancient world the thoughts were in the heart, he has to think of each tribe individually. These are metaphors and ideas I'm thinking about. I don't necessarily think that this is the answer. I'm saying it's an idea. And they're referred to as Avnei Zikaron, memory stones, basically stones which are to remind you, because when he looks to the sides, every time he looks to one of the sides and he's not looking forward, he always sees the names of Israel. This might be like the tzitzit. The tzitzit, for example, appears in some places as being surrounding you from all sides. I mean, usually people wear tzitzit, and especially in Judaism, and they try to make that you have tzitzit on all four corners, so you're surrounded by tzitzit. But in images of what I think are Israelites, you actually see the tzitziot just in any place a person can see. So they're like on the sides and the front. When it said four corners, it doesn't mean that it has to be on all four sides of the person. It doesn't necessarily have to be surrounded by them, because the thing is supposed to see them and remember. So these images actually depict what I think are Israelites with tzitziot more in places that they can actually see them. So if a person would turn to one side, they would see the tzitzit on one side. They turn to the other side, they would see a tzitzit. The person can't turn their head all the way around, so it was into the maximum ability of sight of a person. That's where they would put the tzitzit. So people didn't have tzitziot on the back. They would have them more in the vision, the ability of sight of a person. So maybe it's the same thing with these stones. The Kohen looks forward, he sees the breastplate. He looks to the sides, he sees the stones on his shoulders. And it's a constant reminder of what his status is, because we need to remember, the Tanakh doesn't like the idea of people thinking they're higher than others. The Tanakh has, especially the Torah, has a lot of respect to the human condition, and a lot of respect to your position as a person who's a teacher or a priest or whatever it might be. You're not here to use people. You're not here for your own glory. You're here for the glory of God. And therefore, the high priest, being one of the highest ranking people in Israel, has to have a constant reminder of who he represents. Not only appearing with the names, saying, I represent, in front of God, saying, I represent all of Israel, or appearing before whomever, bearing the names of Israel, saying, I am the representative of all of Israel, but also a reminder for himself. Because he can't wear, technically he doesn't wear tzitzit here, because his entire garments are a reminder. There are some people who talk about putting tzitzit on different places on the garment. The Torah doesn't say that. The garments themselves are the reminder. And then it mentions that you create gold chains. Now, these are obviously not thick chains or anything. These are simple decorative chains, probably thin decorative chains, but they were strong enough to also hold everything in place. And then we go to the Choshen. It's referred to as the Choshen Mishpat, the Choshen of judgment. And there's a reason it's named like that, because the Urim and Tumim are placed in there, and we'll explain the Urim and Tumim today. And the first thing that comes out is the name Choshen itself. There's some debate about what the word actually means. I've seen a lot of different opinions. I really can't choose which one is correct. But in any case, the Choshen itself sits on the heart, the place of thought. So I'm going to point out some esoteric ideas: the place of thought, the place of memory. And it said it's made Maaseh Choshev ki Maaseh Ephod. It's made the structure itself. the way it's made is very similar or exactly the same as the ephod, the armor part, because it's really a continuation of it. And the ephod is really the mechanism that holds the choshen up. The choshen can't stand without the ephod. So the idea is that the choshen is attached from the shoulders and just above the waist. So it makes more sense and if it has to be secured on his chest so it doesn't fall out, doesn't move, it makes more sense that the ephod is more like an armor, because even if there's an apron and some flimsy, like they always draw it, flimsy straps that hold everything in, it won't hold in. Besides the fact that we know the ancient clothing didn't look like that. Excuse me. And again, it's also made from the same fabrics. It's square, ravua versus meruba. Ravua means an actual square. And it's folded, and the size is a zeret. Now, zeret is not your pinky. A zeret is actually probably the distance from your wrist to the end of your pinky. And basically the size was, this size is, a lot of people consider to be half an amma, half a cubit, and then you fold it. So it probably was a cubit, and then you fold it. So it would say that a cubit, say the smallest cubit was about 40-something centimeters. So the choshen was about 20 centimeters or 21 centimeters by 21 centimeters, which is not huge. A lot of places they describe it, especially the Temple Institute, it's a huge breastplate. Huge, gigantic breastplate. But it's really probably was much smaller. A little square sitting on his chest. And really in the ancient world, the art of making small things was very, very common. A lot of the artistry that we see in the ancient world, if it's not edged on a wall, it was usually very small. They were expert in making small items. So I personally think the breastplate was actually very small. If we say the cubit of clothing was about 42, 43 centimeters, the breastplate would have been something like 20 centimeters, which is less than 10 inches. Okay, so it's not huge. I would say it's probably something like 8 or 9 inches. Again, I don't use inches, don't use that system. So I'm going to say 20-something centimeters. You do the math on that one. It's not very big. It's not huge. And you have to remember, people back then were not necessarily big. I mean, part of the discussions I've had with archaeologists is the size of people. And one archaeologist said, they weren't 6 foot something, because we're talking specifically, was looking at me and saying, they weren't, most bones that we found are not your size. He pointed at me specifically. But he said the average size of a person wasn't huge. Okay, the average size of a person was not huge. And therefore having a huge breastplate, like a lot of people imagine, is probably not true. And you have to imagine something much smaller sitting on the center of the chest, and making the stones as well very, very small. Okay, you have to imagine something much, much, much smaller. And it has 12 stones. Now, the thing is, there's no point in me trying to tell you the types of stones here, because the names we have here are not necessarily the names that we think they are. For example, when people talk about the odem and they say, oh, it's a ruby. No, it could be it could be also some generic red stone. One of the questions that we have, and this actually spoke with someone who works with diamonds, and some of the people did the work with the Temple Institute about this, was that as far as we know, they were not able to work stones with the hardness that we have today. Basically, what we consider to be diamonds today, or hard stones, because stones, precious stones and semi-precious stones have to do with also their hardness. And how precious a stone is connected to how hard the stone is as well. And they apparently didn't have the ability to work these types of stones in a way that they won't smash them or break them, because on the one hand you need a certain precision, but also a certain level of strength and force. And this is the claim I heard. If you know differently, then by all means let me know. But what I understood from people who are working on this subject, they clearly explain that the names that we have today, especially the translations and the Greek translations, are based on adapting to stones that we have more today, and that we're actually not sure if these are the actual stones. So there's really no point in asking me, Yoel, which stones are these? The answer is we don't necessarily know. So one of the ways, for example, that there have been attempts to reconstruct the stones is by trying to decipher the color. So the odem comes from the word adom. Pitda is some kind of black stone, I think they said, or something like that. And bareket is a green stone or a black stone. There are a lot of these interpretations, a lot of these ideas. And in truth, I just can't tell you. I don't know. There was on the word Tarshish. Okay, the name Tarshish in the fourth line. Or the word Yahalom in the second line. Yahalom in Hebrew today means diamond. But who says that that's the same thing? Maybe it's some other clear stone that they had, some kind of more of a crystal type of stone. Tarshish is a name of a place. There's a name known as Tarshish. So how do I know? Is this a special stone they specifically had in Tarshish? Or is it some other stone that was named Tarshish? We just don't know. There's no way of actually knowing. So there's no point in trying to explain this. The other thing is that there are rings that hold it in place. These are pretty straightforward, simple things on the edges, and the edges basically on the top and the bottom. Parts are held by chains. It's the top part. The bottom part is tied in by, I won't call them ropes. He uses the word avutot in verse 25. There are rings on the bottom as well, but they actually have these, I wouldn't call them ropes, but they're thicker than just a regular woven string. Because again, you can't use a rope because a rope is very thick and very difficult to tie when you're dealing with something this small. But on the other hand, we're just talking about probably several layers of string that was used to create the clothing. And actually, maybe I confused them for a second. Let me see. So verse 24 says the avutot here, so we have sharsharot gavulot maseh avot, that's verse 22. And then we have, in verse 24, we have avutot zahav. This actually makes it a little different than what I remembered. Give me a second here. I've never done this before. I've never actually stopped in the middle of recording and said, give me a second. Okay, so there's usually the way it's depicted is that there are, so there's verse 20, as the verse I was looking for, verse 28, because it says that there's also a ptil tchelet, a blue string, placed on the cheshev of the ephod. So the blue string is on the bottom. That's where the cheshev is. That's where usually you tie things, because the cheshev is usually related to the concept of tying things down. And the shoulders, so from the shoulders to the breastplate, there were golden chains, referred to as avutot, because they're basically thicker chains. And then you have ptil tchelet, or blue strings, probably thicker than the regular blue string, not the blue string you have in your tzitzit, but probably thicker to tie down the choshen to the garment itself. And the other thing it says here is in verse 30, it says, "V'natata el choshen hamishpat," and you will place into the choshen of the judgment et ha'urim v'tatumim. V'ayu al lev Aaron bevo'o lifnei Adonai. It'll be on the heart of Aaron when he comes before the Lord, before God. And a lot of speculation has come around about the Urim and Tumim. And this actually goes into the article I mentioned earlier, the first article I'd ever read about anything in the ancient Near East. And the thing is as follows. First of all, the choshen is folded, so there's actually a pocket. And in the ancient world, when a priest would carry pockets like this, they usually carried something inside that helped them make decisions. They would ask the deity what to do, and they'll cast these little items that they have, pieces of stone, pieces of bone, pieces of wood, sometimes colored black and white, so they either cast them or they pull them out, and white would be yes, black would be no, and they will pull out, and depending on the number of black and white pieces that they would have, they would come to a decision. And a lot of scholars think that that's maybe the Urim and Tumim. Now, for a lot of us who grew up in Judaism, we grew up with the concept that the Urim and Tumim meant that the stones shone, because Urim comes from the word or, and Tumim probably comes from the word Tamam, which is something which is complete. So the lights that give completion basically answer the question. That's one of the ways of reading it. I'm quite sure that people read it differently. And the tradition that we grow up with, and this is the tradition that shows up in Rashi. So any good Orthodox Jew who would study Tanakh or study Torah as a kid knows this Rashi. And Rashi says that Moses put into the breastplate the secret name of God, the name of 42 letters, or 72, I don't remember exactly, and that would cause, when they would ask a question, the stones would shine and give the answer. And this is the classic interpretation that we hear. However, we never hear anywhere in the Tanakh of how this mechanism was used. We hear very sporadically in the book of Samuel that there was a Kohen with a breastplate, with an ephod, which meant he also carried a breastplate with him, and they were used as oracles. And they were asked questions and they would give answers. And the problem is that it doesn't really tell us how it was done. But the answers seem to have been complex, more than just yes and no. It sounds if go up and succeed. But the question is, was it really just the words of the Kohen? The Kohen would receive the question, put his hand into the breastplate, pull out whatever they were using, look at it. The question had to be, should I go or not go? It had to be a yes-no question. He would look at it and instead of saying yes, to say, oh, yes, no. He would say something more elaborate. He would say, go up and succeed, in direct correlation with the actual question itself. Meaning that the Kohen, his function as an oracle of sorts, was to also interpret what was actually placed in front of him, to interpret the answer placed in front of him. So it seems to be that they believe that a Kohen had a certain spiritual ability that enabled him to function as not a prophet, not a Navi, but as a type of oracle that gave an answer. So one of the theories that came up in this article I read all those years ago was the idea that the Choshen started off as a pocket with stones in it, colorful stones, and based on looking at what stones came out was the answer. And he had to interpret the answer. Now, obviously, the Torah doesn't describe it this way. It says, no, they were actually on the chest itself. Well, that eliminates the possibility of the stones functioning as the Urim and Tumim, because the stones are just in front of him. So they went a step forward, remembering that sages remembered that this was one of the functions. So they went into this interpretation saying the letters would glow, remembering that in certain cultures the stones function as the seeing element. So one of the theories that they came up with is the stones were one thing, but then inside there was something extra. And inside, they said, as I said, there could have been colorful stones or black and white stones that would give white will be yes, black will be no, and based on what he pulls out in his hand, he had to give an answer, but the answer had to be a lot more elaborate. And this is a function that we know that priests did in the ancient world in general, but the problem is that there almost isn't zero reference in the Tanakh. We know that he says to him, Esof yadecha, collect your arms, stop functioning, but there's something about the hands. The hands were doing something in this entire process as well. So again, as I said, this is a possible interpretation. Some people want to say the stones themselves functioned. Some people want to say there was an extra function. The fact that the Choshen is built like a pocket, I find to be very, very intriguing. But the stones were set into the breastplate itself. And that we might be looking at something that has to be reconstructed historically, because we see in the sages a memory about the stones themselves. We know that in the ancient Near East, pockets like this were used by different priests, and there might be something in between. There might have been other stones inside as well that they used, colorful stones. I mean, it can be anything. But the Urim and Tumim are a mechanism of telling the future in some way or another, under the assumption that a Kohen has spiritual abilities that a regular person does not have. because of their connection with the divine. But the Urim and Tumim themselves are I highly doubt the Rashi interpretation that they slipped in a piece of parchment or something with the name of God. That sounds more of mysticism that would show up in the Second Temple period more than anything else. The Urim and Tumim were probably another extra mechanism together with the stones themselves. But how exactly it worked is anyone's guess, because there's almost zero description in the Tanakh, and the descriptions that we have about the Urim and Tumim are so late that they date to a period where it wasn't even used anymore. In the Second Temple period, they never even used them. So there's a big question here, what the Urim and Tumim are. But my theory is that we're looking at an extra mechanism, not the stones themselves, maybe other stones placed inside, pulling out, looking at them, and then having to give an interpretation, which is the classic way we know priests did things in the ancient Near East in general. However, we also have to remember to be very, very careful with comparing the Tanakh to the ancient Near East, because the Tanakh at the end of the day is different. It's not exactly the same. And as I can't remember who it was. It was either Elisha Kimron or Emmanuel Tov, one of them, that wrote an introduction to biblical studies and said there was a massive hype back in the early 1900s and the 50s and 60s about comparing the Tanakh to the ancient Near East, and he said this was a hype. Later on, basically in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we started realizing there are differences, so you have to be very careful when you compare. And this comes from one of the biggest Bible scholars to live up to date. Then we have the Me'il. So I said the Me'il, with an Ayin, is a coat. It's an upper. It's from the word Me'al, to be an upper garment. And very commonly, this is drawn as being almost like a talit katan, just longer. It's open on the sides and everything. It was probably a sleeveless tunic, and it was closed on the sides. And it was made purely out of blue, and probably not very long either, because we need to think about the fact that there are layers here. So we have sections that cover up to one place. This might have gone down to the knees. I haven't seen any garments that we can compare it to, but very commonly upper garments went down to around the area of the knees, just looking at some other garments that exist, and it was purely made out of blue, obviously made purely out of tchelet, and there were little gold bells and little pomegranates. And there are two interpretations, that you had a pomegranate next to a bell, or the pomegranate inside the bell. Now, what's very, very interesting is a couple of years ago they discovered a little gold bell in the excavations of the city of David. And some people said, oh, this might be a gold bell from the priestly garment. Now, there's no signature on it saying belongs to the temple or something like that. It's like one of the professors I used to listen to said, we didn't find an inscription saying I am, this sarcophagus. There's a name and it belonged to like a whole description of who this person is. Usually the descriptions are very, very small. For example, there's a Simon Bana Hechala. There was a man called Simon or Shimon that was an architect, and he was part of building maybe the temple. Heichal is usually a word used to describe the temple. So he might have been one of the architects building the temple. But the point is that they found a little bell, which gives us kind of a context of what these things might have been. Now, the bell, there were no signs of something inside the bell. So what's probably, if this is true, then the bell had a little anvil inside, a little thing that made the noise. And next to each one of the bells, there was a little pomegranate made out of tchet, argaman, torat shani. Okay, so 3 colors, no gold, because the gold is anyhow in the bells. And these are tiny little bells, tiny little bells. And the description in verse 35 is V'haya al Aharon lesharet, will be on Aaron to serve, okay, when he serves. V'nishma kolo bevo'eh lekodesh, and his sound, not voice, because kol can be sound or voice, his sound will be heard when he comes into the kodesh, when he enters into the holy. Lifnei Adonai, before the Lord, uvetzeto, and when he leaves, velo yemut, and he will not die. I find this verse very intriguing. The reason I find this verse very intriguing is the fact that it needs to be as if he announces himself when he enters the temple, as if he's in some kind of a danger if he doesn't announce himself when he enters the temple. And I find this so intriguing because it reminds me of an argument that existed between the Sadducees and the Pharisees regarding the presence of God. That the Sadducees believe that God, at least according to Dr. Regev, I can't remember his first name, but his name is Regev, Eyal Regev, something like that, I can't remember exactly. He wrote a book about the Sadducees and their laws. It's a book that was printed back in 2006, I think it was. It's been 10 years. Fascinating book. What can we reconstruct about the Sadducees? And one of the things that he points out there is the Sadducees apparently believed that God is a very dangerous entity to come in contact with. And you always have to be in some kind of an appeasing reality, that he's very dynamic, versus, if I remember correctly, the Pharisees that believe that God is a very static God, that he does not change, and if he puts up a rule, that's the rule he works with. And the Sadducees believe that there's a dynamic that sometimes you can upset God by doing something, and he'll basically attack you. And this might be one of this verse might be one of the sources they based it on, that they knew that the high priest, even being the high priest, has to announce himself when he enters the temple. Another theory that I heard about this was that the high priest would walk around with the bell so people will keep away from him, not to contaminate him, and then if he doesn't get contaminated, he won't die. There's another interpretation of that. What I found very interesting is I was reading an article written about the Ethiopian Israelites and practices that they had with their priests, and one of the practices that's mentioned is that a person whose status was of a priest or some kind of a community leader has to keep themselves pure all the time. They would have someone who walked in front of them making a noise, and there was another person who had to kind of like sweep the floor to make sure there's nothing there that might contaminate him. So there's a sweeping of the floor, and then there's the man with a bell or something that made or announced that someone important is about to arrive, so people make way. But it's not just the idea of make way, it's also the idea of, if you're unclean, keep out of his way so you don't contaminate him. And this practice, by the way, we know was done, it's a term known as ratzim. Sometimes people will run before the chariot of a king to tell people to make way. But part of the idea as well is that the bells were there to announce himself when he's on his way to do things so people don't contaminate him. And that actually might be a much more practical side to the idea of why he actually has bells in his clothing. Now, we're actually almost at an hour recording, which is usually the limit I work with. But we're only really left here with there's the white tunic, which I'm not too sure if it had sleeves or not. A lot of the garments that we know of had the sleeves were very, very short. So we usually see the images of the priests having very, very long sleeves, though it's not really, it's more glossed over in this description. I'm skipping over the golden plate for a second, the golden forehead plate. But they basically had, there might have not been any sleeves. The question how long they were as well. Every time we have a description that they're very, very long to keep modesty. But it could be that it went just below the calf muscle. It's possible that it didn't go all the way to the ankles, actually was above the ankles. This whole question of what modesty is a whole thing by itself that I'm going to do with my wife. We're talking about modesty in general. The belts were probably colorful, not white. For a very long time, people used to describe them as being white. No, they were not folded or set in a way where they sit also over the chest or anything. They were just around the waist, not around the chest, around the waist. There's a lot of weird stuff that people do about also the length itself. The descriptions that these are huge, long belts. I highly doubt that. They probably wrapped them around 1 or 2 times, but not these gigantic belts that you had to wrap in such a way that another person had to help you. A lot of this stuff that's mentioned in the Talmud, which I highly doubt. The priest wore, the high priest wore a mitznefet, which is a wrap-on, but the regular priest probably wore what's known as a migbat, which is probably a hat. It wasn't wrapped at all. It was probably just a hat, like a little beanie hat or something that they would wear. Migbad actually came from the word giv'ah, which is a hill, which would say, oh, it was like a little beanie hat. And we know from clothing that we see in the ancient Near East that certain people had like beanie hats, so like little hats that they would put on their heads. But some sources talk about the mitznefet and the migbad really being the same thing, just set differently. But I highly doubt that. I think that the high priest actually wore a wrap-on, and the priests themselves were like little beanie hats or something. I also know Josephus, if we're talking about the mitznefet and the gold plate on the forehead were part of one large construction. But Josephus gives a weird description. It also almost sounds as if the tzitz, from which tzutz, which is to flower. So first of all, some people describe it as being almost like a flowery type of item. It blossoms on the forehead of the priest. But the other thing, and it wasn't huge. Again, they always describe it as being this gigantic thing that covers the entire forehead. I think it was probably a small piece, small art. Remember, in the ancient Near East, art, unless it was on a wall, was small. Your items were small. So this might have been a very small, maybe 3 inches long, and maybe an inch, maybe even less than an inch wide. And the problem with Josephus, he describes if there's like this other blue thing that covers the priestly headgear, and the tzitz sits on the headgear itself, but it was on his forehead. It says al mitzcho, vayal mitzcho, verse 39. It was literally on his forehead, but it wasn't very, very big. It wasn't this huge plate that they always show, and it was probably written in one line, because some sources talk about the name of God being above and the Kodesh Le on the bottom. It was probably written in one line in Paleo Hebrew. But what's also very important here is that it says that how did they exactly etch out the words? And in the rabbinic sources say that they had to work from the back to cause the letters to stick out, which is quite possible as well. But the main thing here is the problem of practicality, that some of the way these garments are described are very, very, very big, very complex. And we actually know that things were probably much smaller back then. Things bigger wasn't better. Sometimes smaller was better. So the breastplate was probably much smaller than what most of us think it was. The gold plate was probably much smaller, written in Paleo Hebrew, obviously. They might have even imitated the usage of Paleo Hebrew on the breastplate and the forehead, even in the Second Temple period, because there were a lot of people there who were purists who said this is the original alphabet. Though historically speaking, the Aramaic, and then throw a bomb here, the Aramaic alphabet and the Hebrew alphabet, actually the same alphabet, just the Aramaic-speaking people took Paleo Hebrew and just continued developing it. That's how it's usually presented in the study of writing in the ancient world. But in any case, this is an overview of the garments themselves. Obviously, if I had the ability to draw out and show pictures, I would have. But in truth, I don't think anyone actually depicts the clothing correctly. I think that not enough study has been done on clothing in the ancient Near East. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this. And as always, thank you for joining me again. If you have any questions, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com. My website now has a new URL, which is HebrewInIsrael.net. I took a proper URL. And obviously, again, I also offer Hebrew lessons, Bible lessons. I have a Bible class every Sunday. You can see the details on my website. And again, hoping for productive discussions. People don't tend to comment too much because the audience is still relatively small. And I think a lot of people also probably agree with some of the stuff I say. If you don't agree, again, make sure that you say something about it because it helps me understand things better as well. I can't just speak out of my own podium and say, oh, look, this is the truth. And then everyone says, yes, yes. I mean, it doesn't really work like that. In any case, hope you enjoyed this. And if you're listening to this during Shabbat or just before Shabbat, may you have a wonderful and blessed Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.